Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. So I went to a conference, a writing conference over the weekend. The conference shall remain nameless, and the people I saw shall remain nameless. But I had the same experience I always do with conferences and classes. I want to discover something new, but if people say false things, I do want to argue with them, but then they turn out to be very, very nice people. So I feel really bad arguing with them. It's kind of the pattern um, of my experience with my desire to learn things from other writers. I even brought, just in conversation, I brought up how my MFA was terrible, because, and I usually say it's because I'm so bullheaded. It's a bit more complicated than that. It's because what they tell me is wrong, and I'm right. But then most of them are very nice, and I don't want to argue with them. Um, the nature of the advice you get from things like this, I mean, there was a pattern I noticed in just the nature of the writing advice. They use the cataloging method, which is uh, it's not the worst method, but it's directly related to the worst method. It's it's like taking the worst method of teaching writing and breaking it up into parts. So uh, it's both difficult to refute and too easy to refute to really make it necessary to refute. So, if and it really relies on the false logic that comes with a lot of writing advice of the false universal, which I think is, the biggest obstacle to really understanding how any art form works is creating a false universal. So, if somebody is giving writing advice and they just create this basic false universal, um, then, I can run down all the different ways to refute it. So, if somebody makes a claim, all good writing is blank, I can mount an argument and say, if all good writing is blank, then why is this good writing if it doesn't fit the blank right there? And then I can, catalog all the cognitive biases that um, cause people to force something to fit an answer when it doesn't really fit an answer, and that sort of thing. So it's easier to mount an argument against it. Just traditionally, the people are too nice to really do that. Um, even though what they say is false. And I think that's a lot of why these sorts of ideas propagate, is because people seem to be experts. They say false things, and then they're you don't want to argue against them because they're so nice. But the cataloging method is really just taking that basic idea and spreading it across smaller components. So instead of making an argument that all good writing is, whatever, they say, here are all the components of writing. And I would say it's slightly not quite as bad as the worst method for teaching writing, because at least it's like, think about this component. It doesn't make any sort of valid claims about this component. And I talked about that a bit with Virginia Woolf and POV and concrete imagery. So, the way Virginia Woolf really refutes that sort of approach, you can catalog any sort of component where the taken for granted truism of writing advice that you always hear, Virginia Woolf directly refutes most of it, if not all of it. But she says, you might hear the advice, um, good prose should be concrete heavy, show don't tell, that sort of thing. You can go through Virginia Woolf and you can see, she has these beautiful sections that are, concrete, full of concrete imagery. She's that approach to prose, she's an expert at. But you have a lot of beautiful sections where she doesn't do that. So if you said, here's the secret to great prose, concrete imagery. Always use concrete imagery. That's just not true. And you can easily refute that with a lot of great prose. If you said, and I used to hear this was the most absurd one. POV, be conscious of your POVs and don't change POV. And usually it was this emphasis on close third as being the most effective POV. So essentially it was saying, use close third POV and don't change that. Find one character to attach to And, you prove that by saying, here are all the different examples where close third POV, consistent close third POV throughout the text is effective. I mean, there's plenty of examples where it works fantastically. But that's not an absolute. That's just saying, here's a good thing you can do. Virginia Woolf breaks that. Kafka breaks that constantly. I talked about that in previous episodes. But one, I forgot most of them, but one that I heard at the conference that's kind of like that is dialogue should always advance the plot, or advance the story. Plot, quote unquote plot. Dialogue should always advance the story or reveal character. And I've heard that one plenty of times before. But it's designed in such a way, and it's not really true. I mean, if you're doing dialogue, it's not bad, and then it's sort of a claim that's designed to be refutation proof. If you were doing dialogue, and you're conscious of what the function of the dialogue is, it's not a bad idea. It's not an absolute, but it's not a bad idea. This is why I'm saying, the cataloging method is one of the most popular methods. You read all kinds of creative writing textbooks, and it's entirely this sort of system and nothing else. But if you say, what is this dialogue doing? Is it advancing the story? Well, okay, good. It's working fine. Is it revealing character? Sure. But it can also be beautiful. I mean, that always gets missed out. I mean, it's like the prose thing. Prose should be full of concrete imagery. I think my dog Siku is going crazy, barking at my cockatiel. I don't know what he's planning to accomplish by barking at the cockatiel. But anyway, your barking needs to advance the story or reveal your character. It definitely reveals your character. You bark at things for no reason. But anyway, yeah, I mean, always when I hear this sort of cataloging, dualistic absolutes, I mean, it's absolutes, but especially the dualistic absolutes. Bad is always this one thing. Good is always this one thing. Always when I hear that, a lot of the times it's this very particular thing without any explanation of why it works. So it's like, good prose is concrete, but why is it why is good prose concrete? I'm always hoping for some sort of explanation of that. But always the thing that's always missing is just good prose can be concrete, or it could just be beautiful. It can sound nice. It can have a musical quality. I mean, why does Virginia Woolf's more abstract prose work? Because it's beautiful. I mean, it has a musical quality. It could be full of abstractions, but concrete imagery is not the only way you achieve beautiful prose. You can achieve it through, musical quality. And the same thing is true with dialogue. Dialogue can be funny. If you're reading through a book and you have really funny dialogue. I mean, I'm thinking of Kurt Vonnegut, especially. Most of Kurt Vonnegut's dialogue vast majority of it is not really advancing a story. A lot of it is just funny. A lot of it is really interesting, thought-provoking. But that's kind of the refutation dodge, is the revealing character. If you have a good character, and a good character says something, what is a line that doesn't reveal the dialogue? I mean, doesn't reveal... What is dialogue that doesn't reveal a dialogue? That doesn't make any sense. What is dialogue that doesn't reveal a character? If it's a good character, and the good character is organically saying something, I think a more effective sort of way to frame that is to say, don't overtly control your character to be a tool of whatever sort of thing you want the character to achieve. That's directly counter to the idea of the dialogue advancing plot. That goes into the subjecthood-objecthood issue. I think that's a much more effective way of really considering characters. give characters subjecthood, give them self-control. But that's not an absolute, because sometimes you need to make them objects. If you want to advance the story, sometimes you have to make compromises. So it's not, every single thing the character has to do has to be self-controlled. Sometimes you just have to make compromises and juggle things around. But I think ultimately, if you give a character subjecthood, and the dialogue springs naturally from who that character is, it could be plot advancing dialogue, it could be character revealing dialogue, it could be beautiful dialogue, it could be funny dialogue, it could be just a whole range of things. But I think, the more productive way of even considering it is giving the character subjecthood. So the absolute, this is where the rainbow circle even comes from, is trying to consider how to frame properly what an actual absolute would be. The actual absolute is optimizing the stimulation of the reader through elimination of the barrier between self and other. So that's the center of the rainbow circle. So how do you actually do that? If you set it up as this absolute that dialogue really only has these two functions, but then you discover in giving your character subjecthood, giving a character subjecthood is just a way of giving a character life. That's kind of the idea of the elimination of barrier between self and other. If you, one living being recognizing another sentient living being, there's just an intrinsic irrational connection there, and mirror neuron based empathy that occurs. So if you make your character living, you're more likely to experience the same things that characters experiencing. That's just how the mechanism of that of subjecthood. So if your character is a subject, the dialogue comes from that. It'll reveal character just naturally. There's no real way to refute that. But it might just be funny, or it might just be beautiful, or it might just have all these other different functions. So I always want to hear the cataloging method. I imagine, what if you taught other art forms that way? So just thinking about the whole idea of dialogue. Dialogue can be beautiful because it's musical. What if you taught music that way? If you had, and I've used this analogy plenty of times, but just imagine going to a music conference and you had people from different genres. You had a jazz musician and a classical musician and a rock musician. That doesn't happen in conferences. It's always just one genre. I think literary fiction, the equivalent is pop music. That's a whole other argument. So let's say you had, speakers at a conference who were literary fiction writers, the equivalent pop musicians. Let's say you had, 5 pop musicians giving a speech about how music worked, and they said, when you play music, you have to consider the treble and the bass. The treble should be this, and the bass should always be this. You should always have a rhythm guitar, or you should always have a synthesizer, and you should always have, a drum machine, and you should always have dancers, whatever. If you had this sort of these categorical absolutes, and then somebody in your audience wanted to make, Schopenhauer music, or wanted to make Broadway music. I've been listening to a lot of Broadway lately. Somebody wanted to make Broadway music. What if the pop musician said, "Don't make your hooks too melodramatic. Don't bog your song down in a storyline. It just needs to be 3 minutes long. Who is the character in the story? It's someone who's in love, and that's it. What does the character need to be in a song? The pop musician's going to say it's someone who in love, who has this unrequited love. That's what songs should always be, which is silly. But it's cataloging method is the worst way. The second worst way to teach any sort of art form, and you apply that to any other art form. It should always be, just in terms of cataloging, at the very least, you're conscious of the different parts. But if you frame those parts as an if-then proposition, so if you say, if you want to blank, then you do this. So if you want to make this type of music, then here is a good way to make this type of music. If you want to make jazz music, then the treble should be the saxophone. I don't know anything about music. If you want to make rock and roll music, here's what the treble should be, and here's what the bass should be, and here's how the bass should work. But if you come up with a brand new way of doing that, if you added just a different instrument that's not typical of rock music, well, you have something interesting. It's not an absolute at all. But anyway, I can go on and on. I might just make a long string of videos just about how much I hate the cataloging method. But anyway, see you on the next episode.